7 years on from the onset of this global financial crisis, have we turned a corner?
Well, I think we have. Clearly, if you give a lot of consideration to the data, the analysis that we're seeing, the financial market activity, it does seem that we have turned the corner. Of course, turning the corner from a financial crisis perspective may mean different things to different people. It might mean, for example, for economists and for countries and treasuries looking at their economies, they may say we've turned the corner. From the point of view of capital markets and capital markets regulation, I think we're still in the midst of the regulation that's required to try and ensure as best we can as securities regulators to avoid another financial crisis, at least from our perspective. So I think we've turned the corner from a financial crisis perspective in defining what that means, but I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to avoid another financial crisis of the same sort that we saw in the past.
Now, we've had basically throughout this crisis, we've seen evidence that market ordering is not as efficient as we've been led to believe, that the efficient market hypothesis is not even semi-strong. To what extent do you think are we still laboring under a regulatory underpinning which has been falsified?
Well, I don't think it's falsified. I don't think things change overnight. I think on balance, the capital markets has always relied upon notions of efficient market hypothesis, the efficient markets, markets operating in an efficient manner from the point of view of that hypothesis underpinning a lot of the market ordering, the market behavior. So I think one would obviously expect that both financial economists and others would examine the market and ask themselves, well, there seems to be something wrong with this theory today. And then you might ask yourself, what is wrong with this theory today? Is there anything wrong with it today? And frankly, what's driving the markets today is clearly the things that you're very familiar with, and clearly that IOSCO is very familiar with. And I think one of the biggest drivers of that today is technology. And one of the biggest drivers of that, the use of technology today, is obviously the ability to innovate both by way of products and markets globally. And so that's it. Has always been the case that, in other words, we've had the development of global markets. We also have the notion that markets are developing globally in other markets that we're seeing outside of the developed markets. So I think what we're seeing today is certain aspects of the financial markets theory is being challenged by technology, globalization, innovation, and other such factors.
And one of the other things that we're witnessing as a consequence of this change in technology is the emergence of problems of collusion between major banks in the setting of critical benchmarks. Now, this has been a priority for IOSCO.
Right.
How worrying a situation is it that the benchmarks have been corrupted in such a systematic way?
Well, it's very clear that the financial implications associated with market manipulation and the corruption of the benchmarks and how it affects the financial markets, everything from derivatives through to long-term contracts to mortgages to whatever way these benchmarks are utilized, is very serious, obviously, because when you step back, you ask yourself the following question: what can you rely on? What do I believe? What can I believe? And I think it's really important that both regulators and the financial markets have some belief in the integrity of the use of something that's so important in the financial market. So I think that kind of corruption, market manipulation, has a very serious impact. The problem with it is, of course, how do you deal with it? Well, enforcement is a very blunt instrument to deal with market manipulation when the impact of it's already occurred. And then you're continuing to try and figure out, well, that impact is still ongoing. They're embedded in so many of the financial products, in long-term contracts, et cetera. So you're always still dealing with the notion that you have this, but it also occurred in a circumstance in which, I guess, it was not evident, or it was missed. So the regulation today that securities regulators and other regulators are involved in is obviously an effort to try and do a number of things to create greater integrity in the benchmark, but also create an opportunity to reduce market manipulation. Now, here's the challenge with market manipulation. There's a lot of smoke-filled rooms in the world. There are a lot of places in which participants can get together and decide to agree, to conspire, to collude. And obviously that kind of collusion can reduce the integrity of a particular benchmark, for an example. So regulators and governments have attempted over this past period to put in place a system to try and reduce not only the market manipulation, but to enhance the integrity of those benchmarks. And you know very well what IOSCO has achieved in that area in producing an extremely worthwhile paper on benchmarks, and I think is being relied on to a great extent globally. Bottom line is this though, manipulation, that's a difficult area. That goes to integrity, that goes to human behavior, that goes to the ability of securities regulators to be able to reduce the opportunity for human behavior to not act in a corrupt manner. And I can tell you that's a challenge that we've had for, through eternity. And regulation can only go so far to deal with that issue, but it's our responsibility to at least try and address it.
And to what extent then do you welcome the increasing involvement of competition regulators into this space? Do you regard that as something which is advantageous to reform?
Well, I think the interesting part about competition regulators is they have a very extensive appreciation of a couple of things. One is they really understand efficiency. And they kind of understand what it means to try and drive efficiency in markets, because it is really the lifeblood of competition to drive efficiency. And the fundamental rationale of competition regulators globally, worldwide, is the efficiency rationale. And of course, efficiency is an important rationale for securities regulators. What kind of efficiency are we talking about here? But what is really interesting about competition regulators is they're really very comfortable in the area of corporate concentration. They're very comfortable in the area of abuse of market power and monopolization. It's a comfortable space that they're in, that they understand, and they try and analyze and obtain facts to be able to apply to these various structures which have developed, which can potentially reduce the overall welfare of the public in these particular areas. And so I think competition regulators have something to add to the debate, particularly when we're relying on global infrastructure, global banks, global firms operating with significant market power in many countries, and the ability of competition regulators to come into that space and talk about the implications of that from an economic welfare perspective, I think is very worthwhile.
And to what extent then is IOSCO facilitating that by involving competition regulators in its own conversations about the future of market conduct regulation?
I think it's an ongoing issue. I mean, I think basically IOSCO is thinking about that, and I know we are talking about that, and I think there's no question that we've had to accommodate a great deal of competition thinking in our own work, particularly in the area of market structure. And most or many countries, certainly in North America, clearly in Europe, to some extent in other parts of the world, with the introduction of competition to exchanges, alternative trading systems, or ECNs as well, that is about competition, that is about market efficiency, that is about dealing with areas of pricing, costs, reducing the costs of participating in the markets, trading fees, data fees, whatever it might be the result of introducing competition. And so within IOSCO, of course, we've had to deal with market structure for many years now and the introduction of competition. And so therefore, we've had no choice in IOSCO to be talking about it, and therefore I think there is discussion around that issue. Whether or not, for example, competition becomes a fundamental principle of securities regulation or part of the statutes, which I think has occurred in the UK, in the FCA. I think competition is explicit in their statute. It's certainly not in my legislation, but clearly in my own legislation, there's a very, very strong market efficiency rationale. So bottom line here is that I think we talk about it, and I think more discussion will occur around it, but whether or not it becomes an explicit principle or explicit goal within our legislation, of course, is another matter.
Howard Heston, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you.